Tone on the right side, Scott Kalitta on the left.
You watch, Scott makes a decent run down the track, run that got him in the show, but at 300 miles per hour, approaching the finish line, the car exploded, and as a result, the car went off the end of the track, and the injuries from that accident took Scott Kalitta from us.
There is a photograph that gets passed around in drag racing circles. You've probably seen it if you've spent any time at all digging into the sport's history. A little boy no older than 2 is sitting in the cockpit of a top-fueled dragster after a win at the 1964 Smokers Fuel and Gas Championships. And he's got his tiny hands wrapped around the butterfly steering wheel, and he is grinning like he owns the place. The name on the side of that car is Kalitta. The little boy is Conrad Kalitta's son. His name is Scott. And from that moment forward, his fate and the fate of drag racing were connected in a way that neither of them fully understood yet. 58 years after that photograph was taken, the sport would have to reckon with what it cost to put people in these machines. And the reckoning would happen because of that same little boy. So before we get into it, let's talk about where drag racing was in the early 2000s, because the context matters a lot here. By 2003 or 2004, Top Fuel and Funny Car had become something genuinely alien to the sport's early roots. These cars were running the quarter mile in under 4.5 seconds. Terminal speeds were pushing 330 miles per hour and trending upward every season. The chassis technology had gotten extraordinarily good. The safety equipment, the hands device, the stronger roll cages, the better harnesses had all improved dramatically, and NHRA had been pretty good about continuously updating its safety requirements. From the outside, this looked like a sport that had figured out how to be dangerous and survivable at the same time. The shutout areas at most national event tracks were long enough for a car that stopped normally, long enough if the parachutes deployed, long enough if the brakes held, long enough if everything worked. That is the operating assumption that underpinned the entire sport in the summer of 2008. If everything works, a nitro car can be stopped. Nobody had really asked out loud what happens if nothing works. Now, to understand what happened on June 21, 2008, you have to understand the Kalitta family, because without that context, you're missing about half the story. Connie Kalitta, and if you follow this channel, you know this man already, but for those who don't, Connie Kalitta is one of the most important figures in drag racing history, full stop. He started racing fuel cars in 1959. By 1964, he was the first driver to go 200 miles per hour at an NHRA-sanctioned national event. He earned the nickname the Bounty Hunter for a level of aggression and competitiveness that his competitors found uncomfortable and his fans found absolutely irresistible. He was never beaten easily, and he was never beaten quietly. And alongside all of that, he was building an air cargo company out of Willow Run Airport in Ypsilanti, Michigan, that would eventually become Kalitta Air, one of the largest Boeing 747 cargo carriers in the world. Connie Kalitta did not do anything small. His son, Scott Douglas Kalitta, was born February 18, 1962 in Mount Clemens, Michigan, and he basically came out of the womb surrounded by nitromethane fumes. By the time Scott was old enough to understand what his father did for a living, he was already living it. He was in the pits at events, he was helping with cars, he learned to turn wrenches before he learned to drive. Phil Burgess, the longtime voice of NHRA's national dragster, wrote that by the time the Kalitta operation got rolling, Scott was the kid who everyone jokingly called Eddie Munster for his resemblance to the TV character, and that name stuck for years around the racing community. But here's the thing about growing up as Connie Kalitta's son. As a 1995 Sports Illustrated profile put it, this is a hard man to have as a father. Connie was consumed. He was always racing or building the airline or doing the next thing. And around 1972, when Scott was about 10, Connie moved out of the family home near Detroit to live near Willow Run. His parents divorced in 1975. Scott was 13. He didn't see a lot of his father growing up in the way a kid wants to see his father.
What he did get was the shop, the cars, the knowledge. Before Scott ever drove a professional race car, he was wrenching on Shirley Muldowney's car and working on his father's equipment. He learned the mechanical language of nitro cars from the people who built them, and that gave him a foundation that most drivers never have. When Scott eventually got behind the wheel, he wasn't just a driver. He understood what the machine was doing underneath him. His professional debut came in 1982 at a place called Old Bridge Township Raceway Park in Englishtown, New Jersey. He was 20 years old and running in top fuel. The field that day was full of serious people, and Scott held his own. Nobody was handing him anything because of who his father was. He had to earn it just like everybody else. The early years were a grind. He ran funny cars, his primary class, through the late 1980s before transitioning to top fuel in the early 1990s. And honestly, the results were not dominant at first. He was good, he was getting better, but there were a lot of good drivers in top fuel at that point, and good was not the same as great. And then in 1993, something clicked. He won at Topeka. He set a national speed record. He finished runner-up in the points. And in 1995, everything came together, the way you dream about when you're a kid sitting in a cockpit with your hands on the butterfly wheel. Scott Kalitta won 5 events that year, including 4 in a row, which had never been done before in top fuel. He won the championship. And then in 1995, he did it again. 6 wins, 45 rounds of competition, back-to-back top fuel championships. Back-to-back. He was 32 years old when he won the first one, and 33 when he won the second, and he was one of the best top fuel drivers in the world. Now, I want to tell you one story from those championship years because it captures who Scott Kalitta was as a person better than any statistics can. His first career professional win happened in 1989 at a funny car race in Houston. Before that race, the crew had a running joke at Scott's expense. The joke was that Scott would win a race when hell froze over. This had become a standard bit around the shop. And then the Houston event got snowed out in Texas. It was postponed a week. The Kalitta team stayed. When the race finally ran, it was the coldest Houston event anyone could remember, and Scott made the final, and he was running against Bruce Larson, who that year won the national championship. Scott was behind. His crew chief, Jim Oberhofer, said later, you could see Scott was driving the wheels off that car. He nearly hit the wall trying to get around Larson, and then he drove around him to win. Hell had literally frozen over in Texas. The crew went absolutely berserk. That story is Scott Kalitta in a nutshell. He was going to find a way. People who knew Scott talk about him with a kind of consistent unanimity that you don't always find when you research a person after they're gone. Usually you find some people who thought highly of them and some people who found them difficult, and the real picture emerges somewhere in the middle. With Scott Kalitta, pretty much everybody tells the same story. He was ferocious in the race car, and he was about as big-hearted as a person could be outside of it. His teammate and longtime Kalitta Motorsports general manager Jim Oberhofer said Scott was a big brother, a mentor, and a best friend rolled up in one. He said Scott had a big, big heart. His other teammate, John Oberhofer, talked about three distinct versions of Scott as a person: a young Scott before he met his wife, Kathy, a different Scott after he met Kathy, and a third Scott who became a father. Three different people, and all of them were remarkable in their own way. Scott married Kathy in November of 1990, and by every account, that changed him profoundly. When they had their first son, Corey, and then their second, Colin, Scott became a father in the fullest sense of the word. The Tampa Bay Times ran a feature after his death titled "A Racer, but More, a Dad." That headline is something people who knew him confirmed was exactly right. The family lived on Sneed Island in Florida, near Palmetto in Manatee County. He was also running a boat marina down there. This was a full life outside the racetrack. But the practical joker part of Scott Kalitta is something you have to know about because it tells you about the man's energy and his relationship with the people around him. His running prank war with Corey McLenithan is legendary in NHRA paddock lore. McLenithan once had Simpson manufacture a set of pink parachutes with "I Heart Corey Mac" sewn onto them and had them secretly swapped onto Scott's car before a race. Scott didn't discover the switch until he deployed them at the top end of the track going 200 and something miles per hour, and those pink chutes blossomed out behind him in front of 30,000 people. His response was to break into McLenithan's hotel room and place a life-size cardboard cutout of Joe Amato behind the shower curtain, so that when Corey went to take a shower and pulled back the curtain, he nearly threw a punch at a piece of cardboard. McLenithan called Scott's room, and Scott was laughing so hard he could barely speak.
Another time, McLenithan put a license plate frame on Scott's tow vehicle with an unprintable message on it. Scott drove around for 3 consecutive events before anyone told him. McLenithan said later, "I always told Scott, how much can you really hate me when you named your son after me?" Colin, like Corey McLenithan. Close enough. But there was another side to Scott's generosity that most people outside the racing world never heard about. When a friend named Nicky Boninfante had his father's funny car destroyed in a crash at Baton Rouge, and the family had no way to afford a replacement, Scott Kalitta showed up at their shop and told them to take a complete funny car from the Kalitta shop. Just take it. If you feel like paying us someday, okay, but if not, just go racing and don't worry about it. Boninfante said, "Connie and Scott did things like this all the time, and nobody outside the racing community knew about it." And when Blaine Johnson was killed in 1996, Scott chartered a flight and brought the entire Kalitta team to California for the funeral. Del Worsham summed it up pretty well. He said, "Scott Kalitta was already a legend, and he would be one forever because he was a champion on the track and a champion off it." Now, let's talk about the complicated relationship between Scott and his father, Connie, because it is one of the most interesting dynamics in drag racing history. Connie was the crew chief and the team owner, and Scott was his driver, and that combination had produced 2 championships and some of the best runs in Top Fuel history. But Sports Illustrated captured something when they profiled both men in 1995 that I keep coming back to. The piece described Connie as the son's biggest fan who would never own up to it. Said it was easier for him to face an onrushing slab of concrete than to just tell his son he was proud of him. There's a story about the team's autographed postcards. They made new cards showing Connie and Scott racing side by side, and Scott desperately wanted to be shown ahead of his father in the photo, but the actual qualifying image showed Connie in front. So Scott had the image secretly retouched to show himself leading. The cards went out, Connie never knew, and Scott reportedly found this hilarious. And then there's the other story. Around 1990, Connie had a brutal crash. Broken leg, broken ribs, punctured lung, knocked out teeth. Scott rode in the ambulance beside him. He said it wasn't him in there. He said he was scared. For all the friction that was built into a father and son competing in the same profession, in the same car at the same track, there was genuine love underneath it. It just expressed itself in the Kalitta way, which was sideways and surrounded by noise, and occasionally through secretly doctored photographs. Now, here is where the story takes a turn. After back-to-back championships in 1994 and 1995 and a runner-up finish in 1996, Scott went through a series of retirements and comebacks that would define the middle portion of his career. He retired in October 1997. He came back briefly in 1999. He went to the Cayman Islands for a couple of years with his family around 2000 to 2002. He was running Transcontinental Airlines, an air freight company tied to the family aviation business. When he came back to racing in 2003, he rejoined Kalitta Motorsports alongside his cousin Doug Kalitta, and the team was now fielding 2 Top Fuel cars. And here is something worth knowing, because it gets confused all the time. Doug Kalitta is Connie's nephew, which makes him Scott's cousin, not his brother. Doug came from USAC open wheel racing and won the Sprint Car Championship in 1994 before transitioning to NHRA. By 2003, he was running Top Fuel for Connie, and the two of them together, under the same banner, created one of the more compelling family operations in the sport. Scott had flashes of the old brilliance in his return years. He won at Chicago in 2005, which would turn out to be his last career Top Fuel victory. He had 17 career wins in Top Fuel and one in Funny Car for 18 total, which at the time put him among the winningest drivers in the class's history. Then, in 2006, came the switch that would define his final chapter. Scott moved from Top Fuel to Funny Car. He was driving a DHL-sponsored Toyota Solara, and the transition was difficult. He'd won championships in Top Fuel, but Funny Car is a different animal entirely. The driving technique is different. The car behaves differently at the top end. He finished 13th in Funny Car points in 2006, and he struggled through 2007, qualifying for only 16 of 23 events. The speed wasn't there. The consistency wasn't there. The results that people expected from a two-time champion weren't there. Going into 2008, he was still sitting 18th in Funny Car points, with a long climb ahead of him to reach the top 10, let alone contend for anything meaningful. His father, Connie, and Glenn Micris were co-crew chiefing the DHL car, and they were working the problem, but the problem was stubbornly persistent. And then, 2 weeks before Englishtown, something shifted.
At Route 66 Raceway in Joliet, Illinois, Scott Kalitta made the final round for the first time since 1989. He lost to Tony Pejugan, but making the final at all was a real sign of life. The team had momentum. The car was responding. Whatever they had been dialing in was starting to work. He showed up at Englishtown for the Lucas Oil NHRA SuperNationals, feeling like a guy who had found something. It was the 39th annual running of the SuperNationals. The track had been hosting top-level NHRA events since 1966, and it had a deep place in Scott Kalitta's history, specifically because it was the place where he had made his professional debut way back in 1982. This was his track in a real sense. He went into the fourth and final qualifying session on Saturday, June 21st, sitting in 20th place, which put him outside the 16-car qualified field. He needed this run. He needed it to be fast. His opponent in the pair was Tony Bartone, who had blown up his engine earlier that same day and also needed a good run to secure his spot. The conditions that afternoon were brutal for drag racing. Air temperature was 89 degrees. Track temperature was 129 degrees. Humidity was low at 30%. The adjusted altitude figure, which the teams used to tune their combinations, came out to about 2,500 feet. Hot and dense air means the engine has to work harder, and the tuning margins get tighter, and the tolerance for error gets smaller. This was not ideal qualifying weather. None of that stopped Scott Kalitta from running 4.974 seconds at 300.73 miles per hour. That pass put him 13th in the field. It was enough to make Sunday. It was fast enough to be legitimately competitive. Whatever the team had found at Joliet was still working. At the timing boards, the run looked like a success. What happened next took maybe 15 seconds, and it destroyed everything. The sequence of failures that killed Scott Kalitta has been documented in 2 official investigations. The New Jersey State Police Fatal Accident Investigation Unit released their full report on September 17, 2008. NHRA published preliminary findings 1 week after the crash on June 27th, working with a mechanical engineer and accident reconstruction specialist named David McCandless and a team from Delphi who analyzed the car's data recorders. What those investigations found is a story about a machine that failed in literally every possible way at the same time. Near the finish line, somewhere between the 1,000-foot mark and the timing boards where the run had just been recorded, the DHL Toyota Solara's engine came apart in a catastrophic fuel-fired explosion. When a supercharged nitromethane-burning Hemi detonates like this, it doesn't just stop running. It disintegrates. Pieces fly. The body of the car was blasted free from the chassis. Large sections of bodywork and rear wing material went airborne and rained down across the width of the track. Tony Bartone, who had already aborted his run and was rolling slowly, had to swerve to avoid the debris. The car was engulfed in flames, and here is where the cascade really begins. The dual parachutes did not deploy. This is the part people most commonly misunderstand. The common belief is that fire burned through the parachute lines before they could blossom.
NHRA's official findings specifically addressed this. Fire does not appear to have prevented the chutes from blossoming. What appears to have happened is that the catastrophic body separation and the debris field from the explosion physically damaged the parachute deployment system before the chutes could open. The distinction matters because it means no amount of fire-resistant materials on the parachute lines alone would have fixed the problem. The system was physically destroyed before it had a chance to work. Now, add to that the second failure, the clutch system locked in engagement. What this means is that the engine, still running on nitromethane, was still transmitting power to the rear wheels. The car was not coasting, it was being driven. Audio recordings and witness accounts both confirmed the engine was running throughout the entire 2,235-foot shutdown area. At the same time, the body was gone, which means there was zero aerodynamic downforce pressing the tires into the track, which means the brakes were working with almost no normal force helping them grip. And without the body, the drag that would normally help scrub speed was gone too. Scott Kalitta was fighting this with the brakes alone. The NJSP investigation confirmed that he was applying maximum braking throughout the entire shutdown area and that he maintained steering control the whole time, keeping the car on the right side of the track. He was conscious, he was fighting, he was doing everything a driver could do, but the math was not survivable. You cannot stop a car from 300 miles per hour with brakes alone in 2,235 feet, not with no parachutes, not with no downforce, not with the engine still pushing the rear wheels forward. By the time the car reached the end of the paved shutdown area, it had slowed from 300 miles per hour to roughly 125 miles per hour. At 125 miles per hour, it entered the pea gravel runoff area at the end of the track. The front of the car pitched upward as it hit the gravel. The nose separated as air got underneath it. And then the car became airborne.
What it hit next is the detail that stays with you. The first thing it struck was a steel catchnet support post, 8.5 inches in diameter, 7 feet high, hollow steel, sticking up above the concrete retaining wall at the edge of the runoff area, with no padding, no energy-absorbing attenuation, nothing. The second thing it hit was a JLG Model 600S telescopic boom lift, a piece of equipment weighing 22,750 pounds. It was parked outside the runoff area by the ESPN television crew to position a remote camera over the center of the track. No regulation prevented it from being there. Nobody had told the TV crew that their equipment couldn't be placed in that location. It was just there. The Delphi accelerometer data recovered from the wreckage recorded multiple impacts, producing over 100 G, some approaching or exceeding 200 G. The largest portion of the car came to rest 250 feet beyond where it first struck the post and 153 feet from the initial impact zone. Don Prudhomme, who was on the grounds that day, put it with his usual bluntness. He said the car got airborne and he happened to hit a post that's virtually impossible to do. He said he would never have thought that could happen. Lieutenant Ron Wenzel of the NHRA Safety Safari said this was the most significant crash he had ever seen in 12 years of doing this. He said, "You're not prepared for a car to break apart the way this one broke apart." Scott Kalitta was transported to Old Bridge Division of Raritan Bay Medical Center. The NJSP report says he was pronounced dead on arrival. The official cause of death was multiple blunt trauma injuries. He was 46 years old. His father, Connie, had been on the starting line when it happened. There are things about what followed in the immediate aftermath that are worth sitting with for a moment. The race continued the next day, Sunday, June 22. Jack Beckman described the atmosphere as like an average day with the volume on mute. It looked the same, but it sounded and felt very different. And in the first round of eliminations, a moment happened that people who were there still talk about. Scott had been scheduled to run Robert Hight in the first round of funny car eliminations. When that matchup came up, the Kalitta team walked out to the starting line together. Connie, the crew chiefs, the mechanics, Hillary Will standing between Jim and John Oberhofer, all of them holding hands. They stood on Scott's side of the track. 30,000 people watched in silence. And Robert Hight staged his John Force Racing AAA Ford Mustang on the other side. He took the green light, and he idled down the quarter mile alone, slowly, as a tribute. Height said later they had thought about whether Scott would have wanted them to really go for it the way he always raced, but he said what we did was a more appropriate way to show everyone the kind of respect we felt for him. Doug Kalitta, Dave Grubnick, and Hillary Well all withdrew from Sunday competition, but 5 days later, the Kalitta team was back at the Summit Racing Equipment NHRA Nationals in Norwalk, Ohio. Jim Oberhofer said, "We're a race team, and that's what we do." Scott was a drag racer to the core, and he would want us to compete in Norwalk.
Now let's talk about what Scott Kalitta's death actually changed in the sport, because this is the part of the story that matters for everyone who came after him. His death came 15 months after Eric Medlin died in a testing crash in Gainesville in March 2007. It came 9 months after John Force had a devastating wreck at Texas Motorplex in September 2007, where Force survived, but barely. The sport had already been responding to Medlin's death with improvements to cockpit survivability. Wider roll cages, stronger chassis, better head padding, the blue box data recorders that had just gathered evidence from Scott's crash. Those changes had almost certainly helped save John Force's life in Texas. But Scott's crash exposed something entirely different. It exposed the gap between what the sport had built inside the cockpit and what it had done about the real estate beyond the track. The shutdown areas, the barriers, the infrastructure, the heavy equipment parked by television crews in places no regulation covered. ESPN's Terry Blount wrote something that cut straight to it. He said, in any other sport, 2 deaths in 2 years would be cause for investigation. There would be cause for suspending competition. 11 days after Scott Kalitta died, NHRA announced the most consequential rule change in the sport's modern history. Top Fuel and funny car races would be shortened from 1,320 feet, the traditional quarter mile, to 1,000 feet, effective immediately. The change took effect at the Mopar Mile High Nationals at Bandimere Speedway on July 11, 2008. The reasoning was straightforward. 320 fewer feet of racing distance meant 320 more feet of shutdown area at every track. Cars would also be reaching somewhat lower terminal speeds at the finish line, which meant less kinetic energy to dissipate. And kinetic energy scales with the square of velocity, so even a modest reduction in terminal speed produces a meaningfully larger reduction in the energy the shutdown system has to manage. Kenny Bernstein, as president of the Professional Racers Owners Organization, delivered what he called a unanimous position from the driver community. He said the board members of PRRO wholeheartedly and unanimously support this decision. And then he added something that tells you everything about how the Kalitta family carried themselves through this. He said, "We also want to thank Connie Kalitta for his invaluable input. He has been a rock through these difficult times." The man who had just lost his son was in the room, providing technical input into the safety changes designed to prevent other fathers from losing their sons. That is a level of character that is hard to fully process. The 1,000-foot rule was called an interim step when it was announced. It was not. It became permanent. It remains in effect today. But the distance change was only the beginning. A man named Dave Leahy at a company called Electromotion in Columbus, Ohio, working with John Force, Kenny Bernstein, and Tony Schumacher, developed what became the Electromotion Safety Shutoff Controller. This system monitors engine conditions in real time, and when it detects a backfire or catastrophic failure, it automatically shuts down the fuel pump and deploys the parachutes. It removes the human from the loop entirely in the moment when the human cannot react fast enough to matter. Track-mounted RF transmitters at 1,450 and 1,700 feet past the starting line provide a secondary trigger. The system became mandatory for Top Fuel and Funny Car beginning in 2009 and was later extended to Top Alcohol and Pro Mod. This device directly addresses the exact sequence that killed Scott Kalitta. There is now an automatic fail-safe doing the thing that the physics of the situation made it impossible for him to do himself. Beyond the shutoff controller, NHRA mandated padding on retaining wall support posts, removing the unpadded steel poles like the one Scott's car struck first. Heavy equipment was banned from positions in potential vehicle paths beyond the shutdown areas, which directly addressed the ESPN boom truck that had been placed there under no existing regulation. Every national event track facility was reviewed for shutdown area adequacy. The sport also did not disappear. The fans who said they would throw away their tickets mostly didn't. The sponsorship stayed, and the cars got faster, even at 1,000 feet, eventually reaching speeds that would have been unthinkable at the quarter mile. Tony Schumacher said in 2013, "It's been a lot safer. I don't feel the fear that I used to feel going to 1320.
Ron Capps was direct about it. He said, "We can't go back to quarter-mile racing unless we slow these cars way down. That wouldn't be fair to Scott or his family."
And then there is the question of what the investigation actually found, because not everything about that afternoon in Englishtown has a clean answer. The NJSP and NHRA both identified the root cause as a massive failure of the vehicle's engine, a catastrophic mechanical failure producing a fuel-fired explosion. What they never definitively and publicly identified was the specific mechanism that caused the engine to fail in the first place. Was it a detonation event? A supercharger failure? A connecting rod that let go? The public record doesn't say. Whether those findings were shared privately with the teams and used to guide technical changes is not something that can be confirmed from public sources. The NJSP investigation also found a blood alcohol content in Scott's toxicology of 0.02%, 23 milligrams per deciliter, 25% of New Jersey's legal driving limit. The NJSP reported this finding and did not identify it as a contributing factor in the crash. In nitromethane-fueled classes, methanol poisoning from breathing exhaust fumes and nitro vapors is a known occupational hazard in the pits, and ethanol can be administered as treatment for methanol exposure. The report noted the finding. It does not explain the crash. Multiple veteran drivers had been raising concerns about Englishtown's shutdown area long before the crash. Ron Capps said drivers had been trying to get the runoff lengthened for a long time. Tony Pedregon publicly criticized the short runout before June 21, 2008. The shutdown measured 2,235 feet per the NJSP report. The general engineering principle for shutdown areas in nitro drag racing called for considerably more. Brainerd International Raceway, for comparison, has more than half a mile of shutdown. The ESPN boom truck was positioned outside the runoff area by the television crew under no existing regulation. No one had prohibited it from being there. It was a 22,750-pound piece of equipment in the path of a runaway vehicle, and it was there because nobody had ever written down that it couldn't be. Don Prudhomme's reaction to what happened was essentially that it was an impossible combination of things. He's right. For Scott Kalitta to die that afternoon required a catastrophic engine failure, a complete parachute system failure, a locked clutch that kept driving the wheels forward, brakes that couldn't overcome the physics, the car becoming airborne, a specific steel post with no padding, and a television crew's heavy equipment parked in exactly the wrong spot. Any one of those things in isolation and Scott probably walks away. All of them together, and there was no outcome other than the one that happened. Scott Kalitta was inducted into the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame on March 7, 2024, at a ceremony in Gainesville organized by Don Garlitz. His wife Kathy was there. His sons Corey and Colin were there. About 30 family members attended. Phil Burgess of National Dragster reported that it was Kathy's first time at a racetrack since 2008. She came back for this. Don Garlitz presented the award. Connie Kalitta received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame at the same ceremony. Doug Kalitta won his first Top Fuel championship in 2023, and then his second in 2025. After the second one, he told Racer magazine, "My cousin Scott Kalitta ended up with 2, so I had always hoped that after getting the first one, we'd manage to get a second one and tie him, because that's the relationship we had. We were always, if one guy could do it, the other guy could do it better." Every year, the Kalitta team holds something called Eddie's Lobster Fest in Scott's memory. They get together and drink a Coors Light because that's what Scott always drank. And Doug smokes a Swisher Sweet cigar, even though he's not a cigar person, because that's what Scott used to smoke. J.R. Todd drives a funny car today with the name Scott on the side of it. He said, "I'm just the lucky one who gets to drive Scott's car. That's forever his car. His name is still on it." Colin Kalitta went through Frank Howley's drag racing school in 2023 alongside Doug's son, Mitch. Third generation of Kalitta racers learning the craft. 2 little boys whose fathers raced and whose grandfather is one of the most important people the sport has ever produced. Connie Kalitta, at 87, still comes to the races, still gives driving advice. Sean Langdon said Connie still shares things that him and Scott used to talk about. Old Bridge Township Raceway Park stopped hosting drag racing in January 2018 after 56 years. The property is now being considered for redevelopment. The drag strip where Scott Kalitta made his professional debut in 1982 and where he died in 2008 may eventually have housing built on it.
So here is what you're left with when you spend a lot of time with this story. Scott Kalitta was not simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was in the exact place he had always been since that photograph was taken of him sitting in his father's race car at age 2. He was at the top end of a drag strip going faster than almost anyone on Earth. That was his place. That was the place he came back to twice after retiring. That was the place he couldn't stay away from, even when the results weren't coming and the young guys were running him down in the points. And because of that, and because of the specific terrible combination of failures that happened on June 21, 2008 in Englishtown, every driver who has climbed into a top fuel car or a funny car since that afternoon has done so with an automatic shutoff system watching over them that will cut the fuel and blow the chutes if the engine comes apart. Every car now runs to 1,000 feet, giving the shutdown area another 300 feet to do its job. The steel posts at the end of the track have padding on them. The TV trucks can't park in the kill zone anymore. The sport he gave everything to changed permanently because of what happened to him. And the man who provided invaluable input into those changes, according to Kenny Bernstein, was the one person in the world who had the most right to walk away and never come back. Connie Kalitta was a rock through these difficult times. That's the family business. That's always been the family business. Phil Burgess wrote the morning after the crash, "It's Monday after the somber Nationals in New Jersey, and I woke up this morning and Scott Kalitta is still gone." He was a racer's racer, the kind of driver you don't want to see pull up in the other lane, the kind of man who gives away a race car because a friend needs it and never mentions it again, the kind of son who rides in the ambulance and says, "It wasn't him in there and I was scared," the kind of father whose boys are now carrying the name into the third generation at the same tracks where their grandfather ran 200 miles per hour and their father ran 300. He won his first race when hell froze over in Texas. He died at the track where he started. And the sport he loved spent the next several years building a world where nobody else has to die the way he did. That's Scott Kalitta.